Which is better, to bug out to a cabin in the woods or to harden your position where you're at and make do with what you have available? Which is better? Is it to train to do Recce or reconnaissance or whatever that means today? Or is it better to train in CQB? Which is better, a DMR or a Mark 18? You may have heard these arguments across the internet, especially within the realm of gun culture, oftentimes argued obliquely using social media as sort of a pass-through where people will express their opinions, oftentimes in context to a greater conversation, without always acknowledging that conversation at the same time. These kinds of subjects are what we might call germane to gun culture, and in that microcosm of our country and our world and our worldview, they are pertinent to the ideas that we are concerned about. But the question one might ask, or the question one ought to ask, and what I'm going to suggest, is to take a step back from these ideas as mere microcosms and do the opposite of what we so oftentimes see as a trend. How oftentimes have you encountered somebody within our gun culture or our community to argue passionately for this caliber or that item or this strategy or that strategy without them acknowledging or even recognizing that they began from a foregone conclusion and are now trying to justify a decision? Imagine a person comes up to you who is not familiar with firearms, and they ask you, what should I get for this purpose? And it just so happens to be something that you're quite familiar with. You're experienced in it. You have genuine bona fide experience in the subject. Maybe you're not the world's foremost expert, but you've seen enough to have a reasonable position, or you have a confidence in your own position, and so you go on to give an answer for their question only to find out that they've already made their decision and they were just looking for you to validate it. And so in this episode, I am going to expound on a couple of ideas and conversations regarding gun culture, the state of our country, and some of these bigger worldview questions, especially in the light of the time we are standing in. So, this episode of the Redacted Culture Cast, which is episode 205, which we've come a lot further than we ever expected, is about some of the big picture and particularly the mechanism of control. So before we get into this podcast has been sponsored, and it is sponsored by none other than Obsidian Arms. And Obsidian Arms is a machine shop and manufacturing capability, what do you want to call it, facility organization company. They are some people who I have known for some time, and they reached out and decided that they wanted to support this side of gun culture, particularly the intellectual approach to it, for which we are very thankful for. And some of the things that they bring to the table, and something that you might be interested in, is if you are in any way, shape, or form interested in either professional or amateur gunsmithing, they make a series of tools, whether it's punches or AR-15 specific toolkits that come with a lifetime warranty. They have a great quench, polish, quench processing, which keeps their pristine manufacturing in touch as you continue to do your work. And they had lifetime warranty means if that any single one of your tools wears out, you can always send it back and they will send you a new one, lifetime guaranteed. Now, moving on from that, they also are a facility that is capable of taking your ideas and bringing them into real life. And so while you shouldn't ask me about this yet, one of the challenges of bringing a product or a concept to the gun culture is, how do you get it made at scale? I can't do everything at the same time, and with the division of labor, they have excellently made themselves capable of turning your concept, whether it's a design that requires 3D development or it is something that is ready to be produced in a shop, they can bring that to life for you at scale. So if you're interested in either their products, they're toolkits, they're gunsmithing tools, which I've been using for a little over a month now. That if you're interested in those, or if you are interested in bringing some of your ideas into the market and you're looking at how to get those manufactured at scale, I recommend you go to obsidianarms.com. So now back to our conversation on these sorts of conversations that go on within gun culture. It's oftentimes pitting two concepts against one another, and I'll start with my examples that I gave at the beginning: bugging out versus hardening your position, recce or reconnaissance or versus CQB when it comes to tactics, as well as in some sense strategies. Or if you're going to go down to even equipment, maybe a DMR, which is a designated marksman rifle, or a Mark 18. Which one should you get? Which one should you train? Which one should you plan towards in reverse? And one of the issues that these questions oftentimes struggle with is a little bit of short-sightedness. Think perhaps if you can recall back to the late 90s, actually even further, if you've read some of Jeff Cooper's works, no relation, but if you go back to Jeff Cooper's works, or you go through the 90s or 80s into the 90s and even into the early 2000s, every once in a while you'd encounter these kinds of things as the internet bloomed, which were arguments like, which is better, an AK-47 or an AKM or an AR-15, M4, whatever. Or you would see things like, which is better, 9mm or 45, or so long and so forth. And I want to take a moment, and I want to encourage you to take a step back from these kinds of microcosm questions and start asking yourself, what are the conditions which might inform me to make one decision or another? We're not capable of making an evaluative decision on whether or not 9mm or 45 is a better caliber if we don't have the contextual decisions upon which, or the contextual material on which to inform that decision to begin with. Now, I presented this before. I want to present it again, sort of a hierarchy of concepts, starting at closer to the bottom with things like techniques or skills. Maybe a technique would be something like reloading a rifle, and a skill would be something like pieing a door or clearing a room. And then if you go a level higher, tactics might be something like CQB, which includes maneuvering and skills. And then you go level higher, which is strategies, which is how do I employ something like a flank, or not even a flank. How do I employ teams capable of using tactics to accomplish greater goals? And ultimately, if we take that layer one level higher, we'd have to get to something like a worldview. What are our objectives? What are our moral imperatives? And this is where you might find people run aground, especially when it comes to things like conspiracy theories. And not only conspiracy theories, but the type of conversation that travels between friends and groups and communities and cultures, from books to audiences, from speakers to listeners, from a podcast like this to a listener like you, or from somebody like you to somebody who you care about. And that is something as simple as urgency. And what happens in this environment, or what I've observed to happen in this environment, is that we feel like something isn't right about the world, but we don't seem to have an accurate description of what that wrongness is. Or on the inverse, there are people who seem all too confident about explaining what's going on, but never provide solutions. You could make a accusation at somebody like Alex Jones, who has spent years talking on radio and other platforms about all the things that are wrong about the world, but he himself doesn't seem to be, at least publicly, maneuvering to solve those problems. He is satisfied within the context of his company, or perhaps more honestly, his division of labor, to only talk about the problems instead of provide bona fide solutions. And so I'm going to return to this a couple times. We have ideas like equipment, skills, tactics, strategies, and worldview, starting from one end of a chain, ending at the other, And I want to argue that ultimately it begins at worldview for each of us, because it is our worldview which might inform us to join the military. And in the military, we might learn how to do skills, tactics, and then eventually strategies. Or more importantly, we can use this differentiation between topics to look at things that might be going on in the world and assess them more accurately. Even if I'm not going to present an argument as to why, I will assert without evidence, come at me, that it is important for us at this time to look at the totality of circumstances. An effective strategy would force somebody or encourage the target, the opposition, to become narrow-minded or tunnel vision focused on a single thing while missing what's going on left in the room. And for an example, I'll use the microcosm, the small idea, the small event, the skill, maybe, a skill combination of skill and equipment of using a flashbang. Unlike what video games have oftentimes depicted, flashbangs, your little grenade-like looking things that operators throw into a room, does not necessarily blind everybody in the room. It doesn't create this blinding vision, ringing sound exactly the same way. My grandfather served in Korea, and he didn't have ear protection. Not the same, certainly no Peltors, no nice over-the-ear muffs, and he used an M1 Garand. And even though by the time he was older, he was hard of hearing, it wasn't to the scale that somebody might expect. And there's this thing, this phenomenon in the human body as well as the mind called auditory exclusion, where the ear, the brain doesn't compute certain sounds or certain things when enduring great stress. So the flashbang, when someone throws a flashbang in the room, the objective of the flashbang is not so much to create blindness and deafness for everybody inside the room, but rather to distract their attention, even if it's momentarily, over to what was thrown in the room. That bang, that flash causes everybody in the room to look at it, and that second, half second, full second, second and a half amount of time that the person stops paying attention to the fatal funnel, the doorway, and to look at this bang or look towards where this noise and light came from is just enough time for that first man to enter the room to have a slight advantage over somebody who might be waiting in ambush. And if we are to look at the totality of circumstances in the United States, it would be imperative for us to perhaps turn away from the thought model of everything's a distraction, everything's a psyop, everything's a microcosm, or everything that we observe that's going on is simply meant to distract us from what's really going on underneath the surface, and recognize that some of the events that are going on, if we become hyper-focused on them, function like a flashbang, preventing us from participating in the world writ large. Now, the idea of a prepper isn't a new thing in 2024. And even if some of the values or actions that a prepper, or somebody who used to be referred to as a prepper, might have translated in a millennialish way to being something like homesteading, something like self-sufficiency, or being able to not be dependent on the government for food or for water or for shelter or for protection, even though these two ideas, that of the homesteader on one side and the categorical TV show level cringy prepper on the other, even though they might share values, what are the things that we're looking at that might make us value one or the other? And particularly one that has risen in the last, let's say, decade, is that something that a homesteader is much more interested in is community. And that might have been generated by the loneliness brought about by the internet, or it might simply be a response to the isolationist set of values that the stereotypical movie level Hollywood idealized, Hollywood demonized prepper might bring to the table. First of all, being the person who's going to go build a bunker to survive whatever the thing is and wait for society to rebuild himself ultimately is a very selfish person, because their value is most deeply rooted not in what is right, but in staying alive. And this is how mere survival turns good people into evil people, that they are not interested in doing what is right and true and good, but merely living to die another day. And if you want to have some moment of late 90s, early 2000s nostalgia, think of that one famous speech in Braveheart, played by Mel Gibson, who's playing William Wallace, and it is, you can, live long and die in your beds, or you can be men today. Now, this has been a long exposition, a long development into a series of thoughts and subjects that have arisen in recent history, because we are looking at 2024. It's an election year. There's a lot of weight and apprehension placed on whether or not the election is going to function correctly, or so long and so forth. There's plenty of concern over whether or not 2024 is going to be a repeat of 2020 with an all new summer of love. You can find the headlines. You can see the pundits talking about it. You can look across the internet and already find people sort of drumming up that media energy for all of the almost nostalgia now for what 2020 was to many of us Americans. There's fear of new lockdowns, or at least the presented potential of fear of new lockdowns. There's already protests. There's already attempts to make a new George Floyd. There's already attempts to turn people who are killed for most likely doing pretty nefarious things, or at least to this extent from many of the attempts, they've been nefarious ultimately, and then shown to be what they are. The people who wanted to become George Floyd 2.0 turned out to be deranged, knife-wielding people trying to attack other people, or so long and so forth. And this kind of almost nostalgia for 2020 or 2020 being presented in 2024 also has brought up a number of conversations. And if we are going to look at what might be going on in our world, and this is what I'm trying to say, look at a holistic, or even broaden our observation, our scale of observation of what we're doing, I'm going to also contrast that by reducing what you're putting your energy into things that are effective. And so, in a sense, if you are consumed by the totality of American politics or Western politics right now, the Western culture war, so much that you are paralyzed to act in your immediate environment where you have influence, where you can make your friends or your family's life better, or your community's life better. If you're so focused on what's going on out there that you cannot act on what's available to you, you are being made into a casualty, an intellectual casualty of sorts, because your attention is so dispersed that it is not capable of being effectively focused on solving the problems that you can solve, which, if you can solve them, might be your moral responsibility to do so. And there's another side to it too, and I'm going to have to kind of step away from the kind of marching narrative of the subject that we've been talking about and bring up a bit of a story. Not too long ago, I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about concerns about the election or the year of 2024 itself, and the looming threat / conversation about about a central bank digital currency. And this is if for the too long didn't read of what a central bank digital currency is, it is a programmable form of currency at which some people hold the levers of control of what it can be spent on and what it can't be spent on, down to the level of the individual. And so a government might have some authority over what a population can purchase at a whole, with restrictions on its ability to govern those things based on things like the Constitution. But a central bank digital currency would, by mechanism of its capability, not necessarily override that. Maybe it would just ignore the moral consequences of what rights and government limitations might require. For example, or not for example, but to kind of give context to why I'm talking about it today, in our conversation with this friend of mine, I was a little bit skeptical of how effective a central bank digital currency would be, because I don't know if people would actually accept it. It might immediately bankrupt itself. If the United States government somehow came out tomorrow and said, there's no such thing as a dollar anymore, instead we have the government bucks, or the CBDC, or whatever you want to call it. It's not Bitcoin, it's America coin or whatever. And embedded in the code of that coin, the government could pick and choose on an individual level what you can and cannot spend your money on. And I was a bit skeptical of it, but then James Lindsay put out a video called Digital Cattle, which I highly recommend. I got to thank James Lindsay for coming on the show in the past. I hope to make that happen again in the future. But his episode called Digital Cattle, which again I highly recommend you go and listen to, illuminates how a CBDC might function within, our central bank digital currency might function in the United States, particularly that you would be issued or acquire a certain amount of quote unquote digital currency, which could be sort of pre-selected for what you may spend it on. And so the example that James Lindsay gives is that these CBDCs, this digital currency might function like a coupon, where you might have 100 coupons, but only 20 of them can be spent on meat or certain proteins, and only 10 of them can be spent on this, and only 5 of them can be spent on that, and only so much can be spent on these things. And that way the idea of the government could control what you can or cannot spend your money on by not controlling what it is legal for you to spend your money on, but by what even you're capable of spending the money that they've granted you with on in general. Imagine you have somebody who's on welfare, and we already see this happening kind of in a looser scale with EBT cards. You can't just buy anything with an EBT card, but it also provides part of the solution, because whether you like it or not, the concept of the EBT card, or the government welfare card, has created an entire black market where people will purchase this government given money in the form of EBT cards from people who receive them from the government. They'll be purchased, and then you're on welfare, you get a card for $100, and I come to you and I say, I'll give you $50 in cash that you can spend wherever you want. Now I'm getting $100 in EBT, and I'm using that to buy groceries or whatever. I'm using that in a kind of black market sense. Now, the issue here that's being presented, or the point that this is here to bring up, is that one of the challenges that I brought up regarding, and one of the challenges that I think still stands in regards to the effectiveness of something like a central bank digital currency, is that it will immediately produce not only a black market, but also a second form of currency, even if it's unofficial. Call it bartering, call it, just literally gold or bullets or whatever, favors, feudalism in a sense. And you would go back, it would create kind of a dual functioning market. You would have the government markets that are functioning on this government controlled currency, not just dollars and cents and so long, but where the control is applied to the individual's ability to spend it versus rather than repercussions for using it incorrectly. You would have this CBD, central bank digital currency, CBDC, CBDC sort of economy over here, and then you'd have another economy over here, and they would function kind of like a Venn diagram. But then there's another problem at hand, and that is tying two problems together. And there was a while ago, and I don't remember where, and I don't remember when, but I think it was somebody like Evan Hafer from Black Rifle Coffee, or perhaps a Tim Kennedy. I can't remember exactly who it was talking about, but they were talking on the Joe Rogan show about what happens when the veterans have had enough, or what happens when this group of people had enough. And here's the problem that it presents. There seems to be this confidence that those who have served in the military, who still hold the values that are enshrined in the Constitution, would serve as a sort of stopgap against overwhelming tyranny. And while there is a certain level of truth to that, the concern might be something like this. When a person who gets out of the military and starts receiving disability from the government, that is a perfect avenue of approach for a CBDC to be implemented or even tested. So you imagine you have a whole bunch of veterans across the country, hundreds of thousands of veterans across the country who are seeing this encroaching level of tyranny. But amongst them, the majority of them, or a great number of them, are heavily financially dependent on that very same government for their livelihood, because they receive a disability check each month, or they receive certain benefits from the government. Now, those benefits that they receive from the government equally function as a pressure point upon which to be placed upon them. And so if you and I are veterans and you and I are receiving disability, and some of you know some of the stories behind this, that it implores us to be able to be sufficient outside of simply on that government money. You could imagine there arises concern within some sort of rising tyrannical government that veterans who are well trained in things like how to develop a pattern of life on a target, how to build a mission set, how to build a target package. These people have been trained for many years by the government through different levels of conventional military and special operations, and they've all left the military and they've become dissatisfied with the way that the country is moving towards some level of tyranny. What is the best way to bring them to heel? And the unfortunate answer that came across, sort of dawned in an uncomfortable way, was through James Lindsay's conversation on digital cattle, and that is through their benefits. And so if you're a veteran or if you're living on benefits, I implore you to find ways to alleviate that. Don't necessarily take it for granted, but realize that that benefit that you receive from the government very well can be used as a form of control. Now, this applies to the population as well. We've already seen it implemented in various societies and cultures, with subcultures and societies in America that use or rely on welfare. Look at where welfare is present. You will find impoverished, easy to control people who are all essentially morally expected to, not even morally, but implored to vote a certain way because they can do no other without losing their benefits. So if this has been helpful, look broader than the microcosm of skills and tactics, but rather let's look at strategies for freedom and for living as individuals who live according to what we believe to be right and true and good. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Now go forth and conquer.